Have you ever felt the weight of 1,000 eyes on you, judging you, condemning you for something you didn't do? Have you ever stood in a room where your entire future hung by a thread, where one wrong word could destroy everything you'd built, everyone you loved, and every dream you'd ever dared to dream? Let me tell you about the day I stood in that courtroom, my hands trembling, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst through my chest, and watched as the gallery gasped in collective shock at what was about to unfold. My name had been dragged through the mud for months, my reputation torn to shreds, my family torn apart by accusations so vile, so calculated, so utterly false, that I sometimes wondered if I was living in a nightmare from which I'd never wake. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where it all began, to the moment my perfect life started crumbling like a sandcastle before an inevitable tide. I was a successful financial advisor, someone people trusted with their life savings, their children's college funds, their retirement dreams. I had built my practice from nothing, working 16-hour days, missing birthdays and anniversaries, sacrificing everything to create something meaningful, something that would make a difference in people's lives. My wife Sarah had stood by me through it all, through the lean years when we could barely afford rent, through the countless nights when I came home too exhausted to speak, through every struggle and setback that threatened to break us. We had 2 beautiful children, Emma, who was 12 and loved painting more than anything in the world, and Michael, who was 9 and dreamed of becoming an astronaut. Life wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and I cherished every moment of it. Then Marcus came into my life. Marcus Wellington, a charming man in his 50s with silver hair, expensive suits, and a smile that could sell ice to someone living in Antarctica. He approached me at a networking event, told me he'd heard wonderful things about my work, said he was looking for someone trustworthy to manage a substantial portfolio for his family trust. I should have seen the red flags, should have questioned why someone with his apparent wealth and connections would choose a relatively small firm like mine, but I was flattered, excited by the opportunity to prove myself at a higher level. The initial meetings went smoothly, almost too smoothly in retrospect. Marcus was friendly, professional, asked all the right questions, and seemed genuinely interested in long-term conservative investment strategies. He transferred $5 million into the accounts I set up for him, and for 3 months everything proceeded exactly as planned. I provided detailed monthly reports, made conservative investments that yielded steady returns, and Marcus seemed pleased with everything. He even referred 2 more clients to me, both claiming to be business associates who trusted his judgment implicitly. I remember the evening it all started to unravel with painful clarity. It was a Tuesday in October. The leaves outside my office window had turned brilliant shades of orange and gold, and I was reviewing quarterly reports when my phone rang. It was Detective Sarah Chen from the Financial Crimes Unit. Her voice was professional but firm as she informed me that I was under investigation for embezzlement, fraud, and conspiracy to commit wire fraud. I literally laughed at first, thinking it must be some kind of mistake, perhaps a case of mistaken identity, but her next words froze the blood in my veins. She said that Marcus Wellington had filed a complaint claiming I had stolen over $3 million from his accounts, that I had falsified documents, created fake investment records, and systematically drained his family trust while covering my tracks with elaborate forgeries. My world tilted on its axis in that moment. Everything I'd worked for, everything I'd built, every sacrifice I'd made suddenly meant nothing in the face of these accusations. I tried to explain that this was insane, that I had complete records of every transaction, that everything had been done properly and legally. But Detective Chen simply said I should contact a lawyer, and that I would be formally charged within 48 hours. Have you ever experienced that moment when your body goes into shock, when your mind can't process what's happening, because it's simply too enormous, too catastrophic to comprehend? That's where I was, sitting in my office chair, staring at the phone in my hand like it was some alien device I'd never seen before, while my carefully constructed world disintegrated around me. The next few weeks were a descent into a special kind of hell that I wouldn't wish on my worst enemy. The news spread through our community like wildfire because Marcus made sure it did. He gave interviews to local media, portrayed himself as a trusting victim who had been betrayed by someone he considered a friend, spoke tearfully about how this had devastated his family and destroyed their financial security. My phone wouldn't stop ringing with clients demanding explanations. many of them closing their accounts immediately, some threatening their own legal action. The regulatory board suspended my license pending investigation. My partners at the firm, people I'd worked alongside for years, people I'd considered friends, asked me to take a leave of absence to protect the company's reputation. Sarah tried to be supportive, but I could see the doubt creeping into her eyes, the questions she was afraid to ask, the distance growing between us with each passing day. Emma came home from school crying because her classmates had been teasing her, saying her father was a thief. And Michael asked me point blank if I was going to jail. How do you explain to a 9-year-old that sometimes the world is unfair, that sometimes people lie, that sometimes the truth doesn't matter as much as it should? I hired a lawyer, David Ramirez, a criminal defense attorney with 20 years of experience and a reputation for taking on difficult cases. He was expensive, prohibitively so, and I had to mortgage our house and drain our savings to pay his retainer. But I didn't have a choice. David listened to my story, reviewed the documents I provided, and his expression grew increasingly grave. He explained that while the evidence I had seemed solid, Marcus had apparently prepared an incredibly detailed counter-narrative. There were emails I supposedly sent that I'd never written, phone records of conversations I'd never had, bank transfers to accounts I'd never opened. Someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to frame me, and they'd done it with a level of sophistication that suggested professional expertise. The preliminary hearings were brutal. I sat there in the courtroom, feeling like I was watching someone else's life fall apart as the prosecution laid out their case against me. They painted a picture of a desperate man drowning in debt, willing to betray the trust of clients to fund a lavish lifestyle. They showed photographs that had been taken out of context. A vacation Sarah and I had taken 2 years earlier suddenly presented as evidence of unexplained wealth. They presented financial records that had clearly been doctored, but looked convincing to someone who didn't know the intricate details of investment management. And Marcus, sitting across the courtroom with his expensive legal team, played the part of the wounded victim perfectly, dabbing at his eyes when the prosecution described the supposed devastation to his family. I wanted to scream, to leap across the room and demand he tell the truth, but David kept a firm hand on my arm and whispered that I needed to remain calm, that outbursts would only hurt my case. The judge set a trial date 6 months away, and those 6 months were among the darkest of my life. I became a pariah in my own community. Former friends crossed the street to avoid me. Parents at my children's school whispered and pointed. Someone spray-painted thief across our garage door in the middle of the night. Sarah started sleeping in the guest room, not because she didn't love me, but because the stress was tearing her apart and she needed space to process everything. I spent every waking hour going through records trying to find something, anything that would prove my innocence, but every lead seemed to hit a dead end. Marcus had been incredibly thorough in his deception, and I was beginning to lose hope that I would ever be able to prove the truth. Then something strange happened that gave me the first glimmer of hope I'd felt in months. I was at a coffee shop, hiding in a corner booth with my laptop, continuing my desperate search through financial records, when I noticed a man watching me from across the room. He was probably in his 40s, unremarkable in appearance, wearing jeans and a plain sweater, but there was something in his expression, a kind of recognition or perhaps sympathy. After about 20 minutes, he approached my table cautiously, introduced himself as Robert Chen, and asked if he could speak with me privately. Every instinct told me to be suspicious, to send him away, but there was something genuine in his eyes, something that made me agree. We moved to a more secluded corner, and what Robert told me changed everything. He explained that he was a former forensic accountant who had worked for a company that Marcus had been involved with several years earlier. That company had gone under amid accusations of fraud, but Marcus had walked away clean, leaving his business partners to face the legal consequences. Robert had always suspected Marcus of being the mastermind behind the scheme, but he'd never been able to prove it. When he saw news coverage of my case, the pattern seemed too familiar to be coincidental. Robert believed that Marcus was running a sophisticated long con, targeting financial advisors with good reputations, setting them up to take the fall for fake losses, while Marcus pocketed the money through a complex series of shell companies and offshore accounts. He said he'd seen this pattern before, and if I was willing to dig deeper, if I was willing to look beyond the obvious paper trail Marcus had created, there might be evidence hidden in places no one had thought to search. I felt like I was drowning and someone had just thrown me a rope, But I was also terrified of letting myself hope, of believing that there might actually be a way out of this nightmare. Robert gave me some suggestions, pointed me toward financial databases and international transaction records that I hadn't considered examining. He also warned me that Marcus was dangerous, that if he realized someone was getting close to exposing him, he might escalate his tactics. I thanked him profusely, asked why he was helping me, and his answer struck me deeply. He said that watching innocent people have their lives destroyed, while guilty people walked free, had haunted him for years, and if he could help prevent that from happening again even in a small way, it might bring him some measure of peace. Over the next several weeks, I followed Robert's guidance, enlisting the help of a private investigator that David knew, someone who specialized in financial crimes and international money laundering. What we uncovered was staggering. Marcus Wellington wasn't even his real name. It was one of dozens of aliases he'd used over a 20-year career of elaborate fraud schemes. His real name was Martin Westbrook, and he had convictions in 2 other countries under different identities. The $5 million he'd supposedly invested with me had never really existed in the way he claimed. It was money that had been cycled through multiple accounts, creating the illusion of legitimate wealth, but it was essentially the same money being moved around and relabeled to inflate the appearance of his portfolio. The supposed theft I was accused of was actually Marcus or Martin, systematically withdrawing his own money while doctoring records to make it appear I was stealing it. The emails and documents that had been presented as evidence of my fraud had been created using sophisticated software, digital forgeries so well done that they fooled initial examinations. But here's where it got really interesting. We discovered that Marcus wasn't working alone. He had a partner, a woman named Lisa Hartman, who posed as his attorney, but was actually his accomplice in these schemes. Together, they had run this con at least 4 times before, each time selecting a different financial advisor in a different city, each time walking away with millions while leaving their victim to face criminal charges. In 3 of those previous cases, the advisors had been convicted and were currently serving prison sentences. One had committed suicide before the trial concluded. The weight of that knowledge, understanding that I was part of a pattern, that other innocent people had been destroyed by these predators, filled me with a rage I'd never experienced before, but also a determination that burned away the despair that had been consuming me. David was initially skeptical of what we'd uncovered, warning me that conspiracy theories, no matter how well researched, rarely held up in court. But when he reviewed the evidence our investigator had compiled, his skepticism transformed into cautious optimism. We had bank records from the Cayman Islands showing the shell companies, transaction logs that demonstrated the recycling of funds, digital forensic analysis proving the documents had been forged, and most damning of all, we had testimony from one of Marcus's previous victims who had been released from prison after serving 4 years for a crime he didn't commit. His name was James Patterson, and when I spoke with him on the phone, hearing the broken quality of his voice, understanding the years of his life that had been stolen, the family he'd lost, the career that had been destroyed, I knew that I wasn't just fighting for myself anymore. I was fighting for James, for the others who had been victimized, for every future target Marcus and Lisa might select if they weren't stopped. But getting this evidence admitted in court was going to be a monumental challenge. The prosecution was already committed to their narrative, and judges are often reluctant to allow cases to expand into broader conspiracy theories that might confuse juries or extend trials indefinitely. David filed multiple motions arguing that the new evidence demonstrated a pattern of criminal behavior that was directly relevant to my case, that without understanding the full scope of Marcus's operation, the jury would be making a decision based on incomplete and deliberately falsified information. The prosecution fought back hard, arguing that we were trying to muddy the waters with irrelevant accusations, that my defense was nothing more than a desperate attempt to deflect from my own criminal actions by attacking the victim. The hearings on these motions were contentious, with both sides presenting compelling arguments, and I honestly didn't know which way the judge would rule. I remember sitting in the courtroom watching Judge Margaret Holloway review the documents, her expression unreadable, and thinking that my entire future, my children's future, was balanced on whatever decision she was about to make. She took 3 weeks to issue her ruling, 3 weeks during which I barely slept, barely ate, existed in a state of suspended animation, where hope and despair waged war inside me. When we finally returned to court for her decision, Judge Holloway spent almost an hour explaining her reasoning, She acknowledged that the defense had presented disturbing evidence of potentially criminal activity by the complainant, but she also expressed concern about turning the trial into something that extended far beyond the original charges. Ultimately, she ruled that we could present some of the evidence, particularly the forensic analysis of the forged documents, but the broader conspiracy theory would have limited admissibility unless we could demonstrate direct connection to my specific case. It wasn't the complete victory we'd hoped for, but it was enough. It gave us an opening, a chance to show the jury that something more complex was happening than the simple theft the prosecution alleged. As we prepared for trial, Sarah and I had a long, painful conversation. She admitted that she'd been struggling with doubt, not because she didn't believe in me, but because the evidence against me had seemed so overwhelming, and she'd been terrified of what it would mean for our family if I was guilty. But she'd watched me fight, watched me refuse to give up even when it seemed hopeless, and she saw the evidence we'd uncovered. She took my hands, tears streaming down her face, and told me she was sorry for doubting me, that she should have trusted her heart instead of her fears. We held each other and cried, releasing months of accumulated tension and pain, and I felt like maybe, just maybe, we were going to survive this after all. The trial began on a cold Monday in March, nearly a year after that initial phone call from Detective Chen had turned my world upside down. The prosecution presented their case first, and it was just as damaging as I'd feared. They had charts and graphs showing the supposed disappearance of money. They had those forged emails and documents. They had Marcus on the witness stand describing in detail how I had betrayed his trust and stolen his family's money. His performance was Oscar-worthy, the perfect blend of wounded dignity and restrained anger. When the prosecution rested their case, I could feel the weight of the jury's judgment pressing down on me. Several jurors wouldn't even meet my eyes. The atmosphere in the courtroom felt suffocating, like the walls were closing in, and I had to remind myself to breathe, to trust in David, to trust in the truth, too. Our defense began with technical testimony from forensic document examiners who demonstrated that the emails attributed to me had digital signatures that didn't match my actual email system, that the timestamps had been manipulated, that these were sophisticated forgeries created to frame me. I watched the jurors carefully during this testimony, seeing confusion on some faces, skepticism on others, but also the first hints of doubt about the prosecution's narrative. We called witnesses who testified to my character, to my reputation for honesty and meticulous record-keeping, to the fact that I had never lived beyond my means despite the prosecution's claims. We presented the actual financial records, walking the jury through every transaction, showing them that the money had moved in ways completely inconsistent with embezzlement, that the pattern suggested something else entirely. David was masterful in his presentation, taking complex financial information and making it accessible, helping the jury understand that what they were seeing wasn't the actions of a thief, but the carefully constructed illusion of theft. Then came the moment we'd been building toward when we called Robert Chen to the stand. The prosecution objected strenuously, arguing his testimony was irrelevant, but Judge Holloway, after hearing David's proffer of what Robert would testify to, allowed it with certain limitations. Robert explained his background, his previous investigation into Marcus and the patterns he'd observed. The prosecution hammered him on cross-examination, trying to paint him as someone with an axe to grind, someone whose own failures had led him to see conspiracies where none existed. But Robert remained calm, methodical, and his credibility held up. We also played a video deposition from James Patterson, the previous victim who had been exonerated. Watching him describe his experience, the similarities to my own case, the way Marcus had systematically destroyed his life, I saw several jurors shifted uncomfortably in their seats, and one woman actually wiped tears from her eyes. The prosecution tried to minimize this testimony during their cross-examination, but the damage to their narrative was done. The seed of reasonable doubt had been planted and was beginning to grow. As we approached the end of the defense case, David and I knew we needed something more, something that would definitively prove Marcus's guilt, rather than just raising questions about the prosecution's theory. Our private investigator had been working around the clock, following financial trails, interviewing people who had known Marcus in his previous locations, trying to find that one piece of incontrovertible evidence that would blow the case wide open. Then, just 2 days before we were scheduled to rest our case, our investigator, a tenacious woman named Patricia Mendez, called David with news that made his hands shake as he relayed it to me. She had found Lisa Hartman, Marcus's accomplice, and Lisa was willing to talk. Apparently, there had been a falling out between the two conspirators over money, and Lisa was angry enough to consider cooperation if we could offer her immunity from prosecution. David immediately contacted the district attorney's office, and after tense negotiations, they agreed to a proffer session where Lisa would tell them what she knew, with the understanding that if her information proved valuable and truthful, they would consider an immunity deal. I wasn't allowed to be present for that session, and the hours I spent waiting were among the longest of my life, pacing in David's conference room, drinking terrible coffee, imagining every possible outcome. When David finally returned, his expression was a mixture of vindication and exhaustion. Lisa had told them everything. She'd provided details of the entire operation, named other victims, explained how she and Marcus had perfected their system over years. And most importantly, she'd kept records, her own insurance policy in case Marcus ever tried to cut her out or betray her. She had copies of the original unaltered financial documents, the software they'd used to create forgeries, communications between her and Marcus discussing me and other targets, and bank records showing where the money had actually gone. The district attorney's office was in crisis mode, realizing they had been prosecuting an innocent man while the actual criminals sat in their courtroom playing the role of victims. To their credit, once they understood what had happened, they immediately began the process of dismissing charges against me and filing new charges against Marcus and Lisa. But David argued forcefully that this should play out in front of the jury that had heard the case, that I deserved public vindication, not just a quiet dismissal. After some negotiation, they agreed to a highly unusual procedure. We reconvened court the next morning, and Judge Holloway, looking grave, announced that new evidence had come to light that would significantly impact the proceedings. The prosecution stood and made a stunning announcement. Based on new evidence, they were moving to dismiss all charges against me, and they were simultaneously filing charges against Marcus Wellington, whose real name was Martin Westbrook, for fraud, conspiracy, embezzlement, and numerous other counts. The courtroom erupted in shocked murmuring, and I watched Marcus's face cycle through emotions. Confusion, then understanding, then barely concealed rage before he managed to compose his features into an expression of bewilderment. His attorney was on her feet immediately, calling this development outrageous, claiming it was a desperate ploy by the defense, but Judge Holloway cut her off. The judge then did something extraordinary. She said that given the serious nature of the allegations and the fact that much of the trial had been based on potentially falsified evidence, she was going to exercise her authority to review certain materials before proceeding. She requested that both the prosecution and defense provide her with the new evidence, particularly any documents or records that would substantiate these new claims, and she would review them in chambers before making a final determination on how to proceed. What happened next is something I'll remember for the rest of my life. The moment when truth finally overwhelmed deception. Judge Holloway spent 3 hours reviewing the materials in her chambers, during which time the courtroom remained in a state of suspended tension. Marcus and his attorney huddled together, whispering urgently, and I noticed he kept glancing at the exits as if calculating his chances of fleeing. Deputy sheriffs positioned themselves more strategically around the room, clearly anticipating that possibility. When Judge Holloway finally returned to the bench, her expression was one of controlled fury. She began by stating that in her 30 years on the bench, she had never encountered such a brazen and comprehensive attempt to manipulate the justice system. She said the evidence she had reviewed was overwhelming and deeply disturbing, demonstrating that an innocent man had been brought to the brink of conviction for crimes that not only did he not commit, but that had never actually occurred in the manner alleged. She turned to Marcus, and her voice could have cut through steel as she informed him that she was finding probable cause to believe he had committed multiple felonies, including perjury in her courtroom, and she was ordering him remanded into custody immediately. Marcus tried to bolt, actually made it 3 steps toward the door before 2 deputies tackled him to the ground. The gallery erupted in chaos, people shouting, reporters rushing to capture every moment, and I just stood there, tears streaming down my face, unable to process that it was finally over, that the nightmare was finally ending. Lisa Hartman was arrested within the hour as she tried to board a flight out of the country. Over the next several weeks, as the investigation expanded, authorities uncovered the full scope of their operation. 4 other financial advisors in different states who had been convicted of crimes were immediately granted new trials. and the evidence exonerated every single one of them. The stolen money, or most of it, was recovered from various offshore accounts and returned to the actual victims of Marcus and Lisa's scheme, which were the financial institutions and investors they had actually defrauded. The media that had been so quick to condemn me was now running stories about the elaborate con, about the miscarriage of justice that had almost occurred, about the flaws in the system that had allowed innocent people to be convicted. I gave a few interviews not because I wanted the attention, but because I felt I owed it to James Patterson and the others, who hadn't been as lucky as I was, whose lives had been destroyed before the truth could save them. James and I actually met in person several months later, and we spent hours talking, sharing our experiences, finding healing in the understanding that neither of us was alone in what we'd endured. He was trying to rebuild his life, but the 4 years in prison had taken their toll. His wife had divorced him, his children were estranged, and he was struggling to find work with a criminal record that was being expunged, but whose damage lingered in online search results and people's memories. We started an advocacy group together, working to reform the system, to create better safeguards against the kind of fraud that had victimized us, to help other wrongly convicted individuals navigate the complex process of exoneration and rebuilding. Sarah and I went through months of marriage counseling, working to heal the wounds that the ordeal had created in our relationship. It wasn't easy, and there were times when I wondered if we'd make it, but slowly, painfully, we found our way back to each other, discovering that we were stronger together than we'd been before, that surviving such a trial by fire had either destroyed us or forged us into something more resilient, and thankfully it had been the latter. Emma started painting again, creating beautiful, emotional pieces that her art teacher said showed remarkable maturity for her age, and I realized she'd channeled her pain into something creative and healing. Michael stopped asking if I was going to jail, and started talking about his astronaut dreams again, and hearing that innocent hope return to his voice was worth more than any vindication the court system could provide. My professional life was more complicated to rebuild. The regulatory board reinstated my license with an official apology, but the damage to my reputation, while not my fault, was still real. Many of my former clients returned, apologizing for doubting me, asking me to manage their accounts again, but some didn't, and I had to accept that some relationships had been broken beyond repair. I actually ended up closing my practice and joining a larger firm, where I could work without the burden of being a business owner, where I could focus on the actual work of helping people plan their financial futures without the constant stress of overhead and operations. It was a different kind of career than I'd envisioned, but it brought a piece I hadn't known I was missing. I also started speaking at conferences and writing about the experience, not dwelling on the trauma but focusing on the lessons learned about resilience, about the importance of thorough investigation before accepting accusations at face value, about the fragility of reputation and the strength required to fight for truth when everything seems lost. Some people asked me if I was bitter, if I was angry at the system that had failed me, at the prosecution that had been so eager to believe Marcus's lies, at the community that had turned its back on me so quickly. And yes, I felt those emotions, especially in the dark hours of the night when sleep wouldn't come and my mind replayed every terrible moment of the ordeal. But I also felt gratitude, strange as that might sound. Gratitude for Robert Chen, who had reached out to a stranger because he wanted to prevent more injustice. Gratitude for Patricia Mendez, who had worked tirelessly to find the evidence we needed. Gratitude for David Ramirez, who had believed in me when it seemed no one else did. Gratitude for James Patterson, whose courage in sharing his story had helped save me. Gratitude for Judge Holloway, who had been willing to question the narrative presented to her and dig deeper for truth. And ultimately gratitude for the experience itself, as horrible as it was, because it taught me things about myself, about human nature, about justice and injustice, about resilience and hope that I never would have learned otherwise. It stripped away the comfortable illusions I'd held about fairness and merit, and showed me the raw reality of how easily truth can be obscured, how quickly reputations can be destroyed, how important it is to fight for justice, not just for ourselves, but for everyone who comes after us. Marcus and Lisa both went to trial and were convicted on multiple counts. Marcus received a 20-year sentence. Lisa got 12 years in exchange for her cooperation. Watching them being led away in handcuffs, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief, vindication, but also a kind of sadness that human beings were capable of such calculated cruelty. that they could destroy lives without apparent remorse in pursuit of money. The civil lawsuits followed, of course, and while I won a substantial judgment against Marcus for the damages his false accusations had caused, collecting on that judgment proved nearly impossible since most of his assets had been seized by the government or were hidden in ways we couldn't trace. In the end, it wasn't about the money anyway. It was about truth, about justice, about reclaiming my life and my name from those who had tried to take them from me. Have you ever faced a situation where everything seemed lost? Where the world had turned against you? Where giving up seemed like the only option? I want you to know that there is always hope, always a possibility that truth will emerge, but it requires fighting when you're exhausted, believing when everyone doubts you, and standing firm when the ground beneath you is crumbling. It requires finding allies in unexpected places and accepting help even when pride makes you want to face everything alone. It requires looking at your children and your spouse, and remembering that you're fighting not just for yourself, but for them, for the life you built together, for the future you all deserve. Now, as I sit here sharing this story with you, several years have passed since that terrible ordeal began. Life hasn't returned to what it was before because I'm not the same person I was before. None of us are. But in many ways, life is better now, deeper, more meaningful, because we've learned what truly matters. We've learned that reputation is fragile, but character is enduring. That material success means nothing if you've lost your integrity or your freedom. That the love of family and the support of true friends are treasures beyond any financial wealth. I've learned to value each ordinary day, each simple moment of peace, each conversation with my children, each quiet evening with Sarah because I know now how quickly it can all be threatened, how close I came to losing everything. I've also learned about the incredible power of persistence, of refusing to accept an unjust outcome even when the odds seem insurmountable. There were so many moments when I could have given up, when I could have accepted a plea deal that would have required me to admit guilt for crimes I didn't commit, and many people in my situation do exactly that, choosing a certain but lesser punishment over the risk of a much harsher sentence at trial. The system is designed in many ways to encourage that capitulation, and I don't judge anyone who makes that choice because I understand the impossible position they're in. But I also want people to know that fighting for truth is possible, that justice, while imperfect and often delayed, is achievable if you're willing to endure the struggle to reach it. I want you to think about this story, really think about it, because it could happen to anyone. We live in a world where accusations can spread instantly, where digital evidence can be fabricated with frightening ease, where sophisticated criminals can exploit the trust that makes society function. We also live in a world where the justice system, for all its flaws, can still work when good people refuse to let injustice prevail, when investigators dig deep enough to find truth, when judges are willing to question convenient narratives, when witnesses come forward despite personal risk. Your understanding of stories like mine, your awareness of how easily innocent people can be victimized, how important it is to reserve judgment until all evidence is presented, that understanding matters more than you might realize. Every time you hear an accusation against someone, every time you see a news story about alleged crimes, I hope you'll remember to consider that there might be more to the story, that the person being accused might be fighting desperately to prove an innocence that is true but difficult to demonstrate. I'm not saying people shouldn't be held accountable for crimes, not at all, but I am saying that we should be careful about rushing to judgment, about assuming that accusations equal guilt, about destroying someone's reputation before the full truth emerges. If this story has touched you in any way, if it's made you think about justice, about resilience, about the importance of fighting for truth, then please take a moment to leave a comment below. Tell me about your own experiences with facing difficult situations, with fighting for what's right, with standing up for yourself or others when it seemed hopeless. Have you ever been falsely accused of something? Have you ever had to fight against a system that seemed determined to defeat you? Have you ever felt that moment when truth finally emerged after being buried beneath lies? Share your stories because every story matters. Every experience contributes to our collective understanding of justice and injustice, and your voice adds to the conversation that might help prevent others from suffering similar ordeals. If this story has impacted you, if it's made you feel something, if it's reminded you of the importance of never giving up even when darkness seems overwhelming, then please hit that like button. Your engagement helps this message reach more people, helps more individuals understand the reality of false accusations and the possibility of vindication. helps create awareness that might protect others from becoming victims of similar schemes. And please, if you want to hear more stories like this, stories of real people facing extraordinary challenges and finding the strength to overcome them, then subscribe to My Truth Revealed Tales. Hit that notification bell so you never miss an episode, because every story we share is about human resilience, about courage in the face of adversity, about truth ultimately prevailing over deception. These aren't just stories, they're lessons about the human spirit, about what we're capable of enduring and overcoming, about hope persisting even in the darkest circumstances. Thank you for taking this journey with me, for listening to my truth, for being part of a community that believes in the power of sharing our experiences to help others. Remember that no matter what you're facing right now, no matter how impossible your situation seems, there is always hope, always a path forward, always the possibility that truth will emerge and justice will be served. Stay strong, keep fighting, and never let anyone take your truth away from you.